There are those elections that cause momentous shifts in the American political landscape. Of course, the 1860 election is probably the most notable since it caused a civil war. But in the 20th century, there were also sharp changes in the directions of both political parties that put them on a long term path away from their politics of the past. And while the 1964 presidential election, which saw Republican nominee Barry Goldwater destroyed by President Lyndon Johnson, it planted the roots for what would become today's modern conservative movement. But it was the 1980 Republican primaries that saw those roots grow into not only an electoral force in American politics, but the main driving force of American politics over the next 12 years. Even though the new right was heading toward a complete takeover of the Republican Party, spearheaded by former California Governor Ronald Reagan, the old conservative movement, as well as the old Republican Party establishment, wouldn't go down without a fight. Today, we are going to talk about the 1980 Republican presidential primaries when Goldwater and Reagan conservatism truly became the dominant ideology within Republican Party politics. Now, before we get into today's video, most of the people who watch my videos aren't subscribed to the channel. If you would like to support the channel, please subscribe and give the video a like. If you would like to support the channel further, you can also do so by becoming a member of my channel on Patreon. I want to thank all of my Patreon supporters for making this possible. Now, onto today's video. Unless you stumbled upon this video not knowing anything about the history of American politics, you probably already know that Ronald Reagan defeated incumbent President Jimmy Carter in the 1980 general election. But even though Reagan finally ascended to the nation's highest office in 1981, he had been running for president for a long time. While Reagan started off as a liberal Democrat, even supporting liberal Democratic Senate nominee Helen Gahagan Douglas over Congressman Richard Nixon, he would eventually become a conservative Republican in the late 1950s. He started gaining national political prominence with the General Electric Theater. At this time, the United States was in the middle of the Second Red Scare, otherwise known as the McCarthyism era. One entity that pushed the Second Red Scare during this time was General Electric, with their General Electric Theater being the company's propaganda machine. In 1954, Ronald Reagan became host of the program, where he would push the company's propaganda against socialism. Now, when researching Reagan, much of the literature out there isn't conclusive as to when Reagan made the switch from being a liberal to a conservative, but almost all of the literature agrees that being the host of the GE Theater was probably the driving force behind his political conversion. By the early 1960s, Reagan was firmly in the conservative camp, though he did not change his voter registration in California from Democrat to Republican until 1962. But it wasn't until 1964 when Reagan started being considered the voice of the new right conservatism. In the dying days of the 1964 campaign, Reagan gave a speech called A Time for Choosing, which promoted the values of the new right, at that time embodied by Barry Goldwater. Goldwater would get wiped out in the 1964 election, but many openly wondered if Reagan had been the Republican nominee, could they have won the presidential election in 1964? This set Reagan on a trajectory which eventually saw him as the 40th president. 2 years later, Reagan ran for governor of California, defeating incumbent Governor Pat Brown by over 15%. Fun fact, Pat Brown is the only person to beat one future president and lose to another future president, but not for the office of the presidency. Anyway, there had always been a political rivalry between Nixon and Reagan, and in 1968, Reagan announced late during the presidential primaries that he was a candidate for president. Remember, only a handful of primaries at this time determined the delegate counts, and the main reason for someone to enter the race late was to stop any potential nominee. Some thought that if Nixon didn't have enough delegates, that Reagan could win on the second ballot. But that didn't happen. Nixon was nominated and won the White House. From that point on, the rivalry between the two cooled down. Reagan would win re-election as California governor in 1970. After Nixon won a second presidential term, Reagan was considered the front-runner for the Republican nomination in 1976. Polls in early 1973 had Reagan leading the Republican field, with eventual 1976 nominee, minority leader turned vice president turned president Gerald Ford not even being added to the polls. Eventually, Ford became president and ran for the nomination, but Reagan didn't give up his political ambitions. The battle was close between the two, with Ford barely being nominated, and is something I go into great detail in this video. In the 1976 general election, Carter won in a squeaker against Ford in one of the closest elections in modern history. Because the election was so close, and by November of 1979, Carter's approval rating was down to 32%, according to Gallup, Ford running again as president was a strong possibility. But two events happened that November that would greatly influence the 1980 election. First was the start of the Iran hostage crisis on November 4th, in which revolutionaries loyal to the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 American diplomats and embassy employees hostage. 9 days later, Ronald Reagan entered the race for the Republican nomination for president. According to the Los Angeles Times, quote, the 68-year-old former California governor, officially declaring his candidacy before a cheering crowd of admirers who paid $500 each for the privilege, said that he was tired of hearing leaders blame the nation's ills on circumstances beyond their control, end quote. Even though Ford had lost 4 years earlier, he was still considered a potential presidential candidate in 1980, supporting a centrist policy to guide the Republicans into the future instead of a conservative course that Reagan wanted to take. This would result in a number of proxy primaries in 1978 that would battle for the soul and future of the Republican Party. New Jersey Senator Clifford Case, a true liberal Republican, lost the Republican primary to conservative political consultant Jeff Bell, who would lose to the Democratic challenger Bill Bradley, with the Republicans not having won that seat since. Another Republican senator who was challenged by the conservative elements in the Republican Party was Edward Brooke, another liberal Republican and first African American to be directly elected by voters to the U.S. Senate. His primary challenger was Avi Nelson, a conservative radio talk show host who was not only fiscally conservative, but socially conservative as well, attacking Brooke for his stance on abortion. Unlike Case, Brooke won the Republican nomination, but only by 6.5%, which was a poor showing for an incumbent. Brooke would go on to lose to Congressman Paul Tsongas by 10% in another seat that the Republicans haven't held since. But there was another pro-Reagan conservative running to unseat an incumbent liberal Republican in Illinois' 16th congressional district. Republican Don Lyon was probably the most socially conservative of the candidates looking to unseat liberal Republicans. Lyon was a television evangelist who used his religion to his advantage. His opponent, ally of former President Ford, Congressman John Anderson, didn't take the challenge seriously at first. But Lyon showed that he was able to raise money, he was able to hire staff, send out direct mail pieces, and create a strong campaign that could actually challenge Anderson. According to the Chicago Sun-Times in 2024, quote, Lyon built his campaign around lower taxes, abortion, registration of handguns, foreign aid, and government spending policies, as well as some of the issues of the era, like the Equal Rights Amendment and the Panama Canal Treaty, end quote. But unlike the other elections, the primary wasn't close. In an open primary state, Anderson was able to get Democrats and independents to vote for him, even getting big names like former Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon to encourage Democrats to vote for Anderson. Anderson would beat Lyon by 16%. Less than a month after being reelected to Congress, he was challenged by the conservative wing of congressional Republicans as chair of the House Republican Conference, a position that he had held since 1969. Even though he survived, this made him realize that those on the right wing of the Republican Party were becoming more influential. Compounding this issue even more was that prominent Republicans in Illinois, such as former Governor Richard B. Ogilvie, who was Ford's Illinois campaign chair in 1976 against Reagan, started negotiating with Reagan and his team in January 1979 to consider supporting Ford's former political rival. And if those who were bitterly opposed to Reagan in 1976 were now considering him early in the primary process, then there was truly a split in the moderate faction of the Republican Party. During the first week of January, Anderson registered with the Federal Elections Commission as a candidate for the presidency. But at the same time, former Governor Ogilvy was meeting with Reagan's campaign, he also encouraged another Republican to enter the race, suburban Illinois Congressman Philip Crane. Crane came from Illinois' 12th congressional district, which was one of the fastest growing congressional districts in the nation, with many people from the nearby suburbs of Chicago, like Arlington Heights, Des Plaines, and Niles, moving to the suburbs further out, like Mundelein, McHenry, and Algonquin, which is where my family actually moved. Crane replaced former Congressman Donald Rumsfeld. Yes, that Donald Rumsfeld, who would become Secretary of Defense for the first time. According to the 1980 Almanac of American Politics, quote, Crane is the kind of person who is not interested in political security. He is a strong conservative, one who seems to take libertarian stances on domestic issues. On foreign policy, he is a strong anti-communist and favors increased defense spending. As the kind of congressman not afraid to cast the lone dissenting vote, and as head of the American Conservative Union, he has gained the reputation of being far to the right, and in the House, he has been less interested in crafting legislation than in asserting his principles. End quote. Crane was known in Republican circles, but not really known to the public in general. But as I mentioned in my video about Jimmy Carter, which you can check out here, it wasn't necessarily about winning a nationwide campaign, but performing well in the first few caucuses and primaries and carry that momentum into later primaries. Crane's plan was to out-conservative Ronald Reagan in New Hampshire and then build from there. But just months before the New Hampshire primary, many of his top staffers quit, and according to the Almanac of American Politics, quote, top staffers quit, saying that Crane was downplaying his conservative stance on social issues in favor of the conservative stance on economic issues he shared with most other Republican candidates, end quote. This situation with Crane, I think, is an important one to bring up now. Most of the candidates that we're going to talk about in this primary, including John Anderson, were usually moderate to conservative when it came to economic issues. Let me again quote the Almanac of American Politics from 1980. Quote, he, meaning Anderson, has not strayed far from the party's position on economic issues. Anderson is a strong believer in the free enterprise system and free market mechanisms. He is skeptical about the Great Society programs and has voted to trim them back. He does not have a good voting record according to organized labor. He favors deregulation of natural gas, nor has he often gone against Republican foreign policy positions. For years, he backed the Nixon and Ford administration's policy on Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Where Anderson has differed with many of his fellow Republicans has been on non-economic issues. Anderson has also been a strong supporter of civil rights, a traditionally Republican issue, but one not embraced by many conservative Republicans today. End quote. While economic conservatism was the order of the day for Republicans, the way in which to go about it was debatable. Ronald Reagan had already been rolling out his supply-side economic plan, which was to provide tax breaks for corporations so that those corporations would then reinvest that money into their business to help them grow. One of those who didn't necessarily agree with that position was former CIA director and Congressman George Bush of Texas. Bush entered the presidential race on May 1st, 1979, with his main focus being on leadership. This was one of the differences between Bush and the others, as well as a changing of the times. One can argue that between 1948 and 1968, both the Republican and Democratic nominations focused on who would be the best candidate to win, with issues being a secondary factor, if it was even a factor at all. The 1968 Democratic Convention brought issues to the forefront, not just because of the events inside and outside of the convention hall, but with the famous William F. Buckley versus Gore-Vidal debates. By the time 1980 came along, issue-driven campaigns were becoming the dominant force in presidential nomination politics. But for Bush, he was still focused on the old way of campaigning, promising strong leadership and stability. In fact, during most of the 1980 campaign until April 10th of 1980, when Bush famously coined Reagan's economic policy, voodoo economics, Bush rarely ventured into issue advocacy. His main focus was on leadership, targeting voters who still had admiration for candidates like Dwight D. Eisenhower than ideologues like Ronald Reagan. His campaign manager was James Baker, not to be confused with Howard Baker, who we'll be talking about later. There are a few other high profile candidates that entered the race. In fact, former Texas Governor John Connally, Kansas Senator Bob Dole, and Tennessee Senator Howard Baker were much more known than Anderson Crane or even George Bush. First, let's start off with Bob Dole, who was not just the senator from Kansas, but President Ford's running mate in the 1976 presidential election. Even with the national recognition from the previous election, Dole, who announced his candidacy from his hometown of Russell, Kansas on May 14, 1979, said that he knew that it was going to be an uphill battle to win the nomination, especially in a field more crowded than expected. But as with the Carter campaign 4 years earlier, Dole's plan was to perform well in the neighboring Iowa caucuses and then take that momentum to the next few primaries, feeling that he had a good chance of winning New Hampshire. As for his policies, he was a conservative, but also middle of the road. He supported increasing the defense budget, opposed the Panama Canal Treaty, as well as supporting tax cuts and reduced spending, but also supported federal nutrition programs for the elderly and poor, the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as other civil rights initiatives. But as with Bush, his campaign focused on his experience and that he was a practical Republican, not a knee-jerk Republican like many in the press were starting to label Reagan as. Another high-profile candidate to enter the race was former Texas Governor John Connally. Yes, Connally is known by many as the other person who was shot on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, but in 1973, just a few months after the death of former President Lyndon Johnson, Connally switched parties from being a Democrat to being a Republican, right in the height of the Watergate scandal. Connally's reason for the switch was that the Democratic Party had moved too far to the left, an argument that Reagan made just 11 years earlier. This led liberal and former Texas U.S. Senator Ralph Yarborough to comment on Connally's switch, saying, quote, "It's the first time in recorded history that a rat has swum toward a sinking ship." After Nixon's resignation and the ascendancy of Gerald Ford to the presidency, John Connally was strongly considered to replace Ford as vice president. But because of his party switch, Ford didn't think that he could get congressional approval from Democrats and instead went with the safe choice, former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Still, on January 24, 1979, Connally announced that he was running for the Republican nomination for president. But even before then, Connally had already been making his intentions known. He had already made a number of trips to New Hampshire and hired Ed May, a political consultant who had been executive director of the Republican National Committee previously. But Connally did have his problems. In 1974, he had been accused of taking bribes from the dairy industry in exchange for political influence. He was indicted, with the case going to trial. During the trial, Connally produced character witnesses such as Jackie Kennedy and Lady Bird Johnson, as well as a number of Johnson administration members and prominent Texas Democrats. Connally was acquitted, but his public image was tarnished, with many in Texas wondering how many shady deals Connally had done in the past. That past is really exposed in Robert Caro's series about Lyndon Johnson. But the other problem was that Connally was a Democrat in the past, which could pose a problem with Republican primary voters. But being a former Democrat from Texas actually had one huge advantage. If Carter hadn't won Texas in 1976, Carter would have only won the Electoral College by one vote. Connally could also possibly do well with those who identified as Democrats in the South, but no longer trusted the National Party. The final high-profile candidate that we'll talk about is Howard Baker, who announced that he was running for president on November 1st, 1979. Baker, who was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 1966, became the first Republican to win a U.S. Senate seat in Tennessee since Reconstruction. During his time in the U.S. Senate, Baker was center-right when it came to economic issues and a moderate when it came to social issues. He voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1968, with only fellow Tennessean Senator Al Gore Sr. and the aforementioned Ralph Yarborough being the only senators from the former Confederacy to do so. He also voted for the confirmation of Thurgood Marshall as the first black justice to the United States Supreme Court. While Baker was somewhat known to the public in the early 1970s, it wasn't until the Watergate scandal when he became a household name. While on the Watergate committee, Baker famously asked former White House counsel John Dean, what did the president know and when did he know it? Interestingly, this question was supposed to help Nixon, as Baker, who was a strong Nixon supporter, was coordinating with the White House to make this appear as a witch hunt. Instead, it actually went the other way, with his line of questioning to John Dean being highly influential in Nixon's downfall. Of course, after Nixon resigned, Baker didn't clarify that he was trying to help the president, but instead went with the story that he helped save the country. When Baker made his announcement to run for president, the Tennessean, Nashville's primary daily newspaper, said, quote, in a 10-minute opening speech, Baker gave clear indications of the kind of campaign he intends to wage. He sketched himself as a middle-of-the-roader, able to reach legislative consensuses and unite people behind him. He also showed that he plans to point out shortcomings in opponents, but not to savage them. End quote. This basically put Baker in the Dole and Bush lane of the Republican Party primary. With that, let's recap what we have so far. Both Ronald Reagan and Phil Crane were fighting to win the socially conservative wing of the Republican Party, a wing that had been growing significantly since Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign. John Anderson was on the party's socially left flank, trying to capture any voters who still identified as Rockefeller Republicans. John Connally was firmly in the center, but hoped that he could get disgruntled Southern Democrats to support his campaign. And George Bush, Bob Dole, and Howard Baker mostly ran on predictability, stability, and their record in public service as the backbone of their campaign. Yes, there were other candidates running, but they were either not serious or had dropped out before the primaries. But before we continue, there are two big names that we need to address. First is former Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller already mentioned early in the cycle that he had no intention of seeking the presidency. Regardless, he died in 1979 and wouldn't have even been able to compete in the election. The second big name is, of course, former President Gerald Ford. On October 18, 1979, on Capitol Hill, Ford stated that he would not be a candidate for the Republican nomination, further adding that he had made a firm decision not to become an active candidate. But even when he said that he had no intention of running in the past, he also added, never say never, always leaving the door open to jump into the race at a later date. But another thing important about his statement was that he said he wasn't an active candidate for the nomination. As we have seen with Nelson Rockefeller in previous elections, one does not have to be actively challenging for the nomination, with draft Rockefeller movements popping up in 1960 and 1968. But this wording was very important. With a lot of high-profile candidates entering the race, there was a high likelihood that no single candidate could get enough delegates on the first ballot in order to win the nomination, allowing pledged delegates to seek another candidate. And if that were the case, and Republicans started a draft Ford movement, which the candidate himself wouldn't be actively supporting, then Ford could be the Republican nominee. There were reasons why Ford was being considered a serious candidate. First, many in Republican circles worried that Reagan wouldn't be able to win a general election against the Democratic nominee, whether it was incumbent President Jimmy Carter or his Democratic challenger, Senator Ted Kennedy. In a series of Gallup polls released to the public on October 1st, 1979, Reagan was 1% behind Carter, 46% to Carter's 47%, while Gerald Ford was beating Carter in the same poll by 9%, 51% to Carter's 42%. Once Ted Kennedy was added to the general election poll, the numbers got even worse for the Republicans. Kennedy was beating Ford 58-38, but was beating Reagan by an even bigger margin, 61% for Kennedy to 33% for Reagan. With all the polls combined, it seems as if the weakest candidate for the Democrats was Carter and the weakest for the Republicans being Reagan. If these two were the nominees, then it would be more than likely an election of picking the lesser of two evils. And for the Republicans, Reagan was leading the same Gallup poll for the nomination amongst Republican and independent voters, receiving 29% support over Ford's 21%. Baker was third at 10% and Connally at 8%. A lot would happen between October 1st and the beginning of the new decade. First were the early October polls that I just mentioned, showing that the Republicans were in trouble if they picked Reagan as their nominee, which seemed likely. 2 weeks later, that was further boosted by an Iowa poll showing Reagan leading with 40% of Iowa Republicans compared to 23% for Ford, Baker at 16%, Connally at 7%, and neighboring candidates Bob Dole and Phil Crane at 3% and 2% respectively, and George Bush at 1%. 4 days after the poll's release, Ford announces that he isn't actively seeking the Republican nomination for president. 2 weeks later, those supporting the Iranian Revolution stormed into the American embassy in Tehran, holding 66 Americans hostage. As a result, Carter's popularity increased with a rally around the flag moment, which pushed him ahead of Ted Kennedy on the Democratic side. But Carter also pushed ahead of basically everyone else. In a Gallup poll released on December 13th, in a matchup between Carter and Reagan, Carter easily defeats Reagan 60% to 36%. Adding Ford into the mix, since his name was still being mentioned, Carter beats Ford 57% to 39%. When Kennedy was added to the poll, he barely beat Reagan 49% to 44%, and Ford pulled ahead of Kennedy 51% to 43%. 3 days after the National Gallup poll, the Iowa poll was released, this time without Gerald Ford's name. Reagan shot to the top choice of Republicans in Iowa, polling at 50%. However, the candidate that was now in second place was George Bush, who was at a mere 1% a month earlier. Connally jumped to third at 12%, and Baker was falling, now at 11%. Still, with Ford out, Reagan looked as if he was heading to a dominant win in Iowa, and thus the Republican Party nomination. That's where things stood when we ticked over to the new decade. The first major event of the 1980 Republican primary cycle was a GOP debate held in Des Moines, Iowa on January 6th, but was broadcast nationally. All of the major candidates attended the debate except for one, Ronald Reagan. Reagan said that he wasn't going to attend the debate because he called it divisive and, quote, this pits Republican against Republican and thus emphasizes differences instead of what they have in common, end quote. While the debate actually seemed more like a tame forum than a political brawl, the candidates took their shots at Reagan for not being there. Chair of the Iowa Republican Party, Steve Roberts, said, quote, the loser was Reagan. By not being there, he will alienate some Iowa Republicans. It is not a very strong argument when he was the one who challenged President Ford in 1976. To his argument about being divisive, what's his argument about 1976 when he ran against Ford? End quote. A few days later, the new Iowa poll showed that Ronald Reagan had taken a hit in the state. Reagan lost nearly half of his support from December, dropping to 26%, with Howard Baker second at 18% and Bush third at 17%. Connally didn't move and was at 10%, but Philip Crane tripled his total to 6%, now on par with Bob Dole. The poll also showed that 58% of Iowa Republicans thought that Reagan's absence from the debate damaged his chances in the upcoming Iowa caucuses. According to the January 13th Des Moines Register, even Reagan's internal polls and canvass reports were showing that the former California governor was losing ground to both Bush and Baker. Reagan even did an interview with radio station WHO, the station that he had worked for back in the 1930s to broadcast Chicago Cubs games, to do some damage control. But in the end, it was to no avail. Bush would win the Iowa caucuses with 31.5% of county convention delegates, with Reagan at 29.5%. Howard Baker, who had hoped to be in the mix with Reagan and Bush, finished a distant third at 15.7%. The first part of Bush's plan was now done, to win Iowa and hopefully have the Big Mo, as he called it, on his side going into the upcoming primaries. The next primary was the Puerto Rican primary, which Bush won handily with 60% of the votes, mainly because only Bush, Baker, Connally, and Dole were on the ballot. Baker would win 37.3%. While this didn't have an impact on the overall race with Reagan, this result did show that Bush looked as if he would be the main candidate to take on Reagan going into New Hampshire, with that state's primary being held on February 26th. Polls early in February showed that Bush did indeed have momentum. In a Boston Globe poll of New Hampshire voters, Bush led Reagan amongst Republican voters 43% to 39%. The same poll in September had Reagan at 50% to Bush's 8%. Remember, Bush was from New England originally, and his father was a senator from Connecticut, so he had roots in the region. This, combined with the Iowa results, snapped Reagan and his campaign back into reality. He would need to fight for the nomination and not simply expect to have it handed to him. Knowing that not participating in the debate was probably what led to his humiliating defeat, Reagan now agreed to take part in debates. But Reagan's campaign message also changed as well, labeling Bush as an elitist who came from an elitist family, as well as a moderate which would not support conservative values. Even though Bush felt the momentum, scandal was about to hit him. The Los Angeles Times reported that Bush received $106,000 from a secret Nixon White House fund in 1970 when he was running for U.S. Senate against Lloyd Bentsen. Bush denied any wrongdoing, and the story died off a few days later. This story would have probably not hurt him anyway, as many Republicans still viewed Nixon as a victim instead of culprit. The first major debate was a debate held by the gun owners of New Hampshire. Reagan said that in California that a mandatory 5 to 10 year sentence was added to any crime that involved a gun, and that was the only gun control he believed in. But looking at reports at the time, the event didn't really change anything, and it was mostly known for the attendees booing John Anderson for his views on a gun registry. The second major debate was in Manchester and conducted by the League of Women Voters, with Reagan, Bush, Baker, Connally, Dole, Crane, and Anderson attending. Again, this debate had some moments here and there, with the Concord Monitor saying that Connally, Crane, and Dole were the candidates that distinguished themselves the most. Both Bush and Reagan were careful with their responses and didn't want to rock the boat too much. The third debate was the one that had the least amount of hype, a debate held by the Nashua Telegraph. The hype was probably muted because the U.S. ice hockey team had just pulled off a major upset that afternoon, winning the gold medal after defeating Finland after previously defeating the Soviets in one of the biggest upsets in sports history. That same day, the Manchester Union Leader released a poll showing that Reagan was at 40% and Bush at 35% in the state, with everyone else significantly behind. But back to the Nashua Telegraph debate, which was held at the Nashua High School Gymnasium on February 23rd. When the paper decided to have the debate, they only invited two candidates, Ronald Reagan and George Bush. However, the Federal Elections Commission decided that only allowing to have two candidates at the debates violated campaign finance regulations and forced the paper to withdraw funding from the debates. What comes next is a masterful and impressive political ambush by Ronald Reagan. Since there was no sponsor for the debates, the Reagan campaign decided that they would instead pay for the debates. However, they continued to let the Nashua Telegraph determine the rules of the debates. Reagan and his campaign knew that those rules included only having Ronald Reagan and George Bush on the debate stage. But on the night of the debates, four candidates were waiting in the school's cafeteria: Bob Dole, John Anderson, Phil Crane, and Howard Baker. These candidates were invited by Reagan to join the debates, but the debate moderator, John Breen, who was the executive director of the paper, insisted that the debate would only consist of Bush and Reagan. Then the other four men left the cafeteria and entered the debate stage, with Reagan demanding that they be included. Bush, who had supported the one-on-one debate, said nothing. Breen then said that the other four candidates couldn't take part in the debate, with Reagan angrily disagreeing with Breen. Breen then asked for those in charge of the audio to cut off Reagan's microphone. Here is that exchange.
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute? Is this on? Mr. Green, would you turn that microphone off? You asked for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green.
Unfortunately, I couldn't find a full debate clip and can only find Reagan's soundbite. But according to the Concord Monitor, after the Reagan and Breen exchange, Dole was reported to mutter, quote, "Hitler's Germany, Hitler's Germany." Reagan would then say, quote, "I feel that there is some explanation due to you. I asked these gentlemen to come out here and I realize some effort has been made to embarrass them. Sponsors have certain rights. Since I've been here this evening, the newspaper has refused to meet with me about this matter. I was perfectly willing to say that if we could not all debate that, then I would not debate." End quote. Bush then said that the Telegraph was simply playing by the rules of the debate already laid out. After the debate, Dole said, quote, "It was a sorry episode in American politics, and I believe George Bush had a role in it. It wasn't the Telegraph who refused to talk to us peons because we didn't have enough points in the polls. Bush said that he would play by the rules even though the rules were unfair." End quote. He also added that if Bush won the nomination, quote, "I'm not going to break my back to work for someone who won't even speak to me. I do believe George is going to have to come off that pedestal and start talking to us." End quote. So yeah, those exchanges between Bush and Dole 8 years later do have a backstory to it.
Senator Dole, is there anything you'd like to say to the Vice President?
Yeah, stop lying about my record.
John Anderson said, quote, "He," that being Bush, "already coronated himself as the nominee. I was banned by a member of my own party to engage in a discussion of issues. My reaction is total disgust." End quote. Philip Crane said that this incident was a fraud. Still, no matter what the outcome, the minute that Reagan paid for the debate, he was in a win-win situation. If the Telegraph agreed to let all the candidates on stage, the only one that would have probably taken votes away from Reagan was Crane. Both Baker and Dole would have probably pulled votes away from Bush. And if they refused, which they did, then you have the situation that eventually occurred. Whether you consider this heavy-handed or not, this was a genius move by the Reagan campaign. But when the first votes of the primary were cast in Dixville Notch, Reagan and Bush were tied at 5 votes each, with Baker at 4 and Connally, Anderson, and Crane each at 1. But when all the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. While Reagan was just shy of a majority of the votes, finishing at 49.6%, Bush was a distant second at 22.7%. The next primaries were in Massachusetts and Vermont on March 4th. These were primaries that Reagan didn't target. In fact, former U.S. Senator Edward Brooke, the one who was targeted by conservatives 2 years earlier, endorsed John Anderson in the primary. Bush would win the primary in Massachusetts with 31% of the vote, but Anderson was a very close second at 30.7%. But in Vermont, which was very much a libertarian Republican state, Ronald Reagan won with 30.1% of the vote, but with Anderson winning 29% of the vote and Bush at 21.7%. Actually, this was a good result for all three candidates. Bush and Anderson showed that they had strong support, and Reagan was close in a state where he was expected to lose quite handily. But the race was about to change drastically. On March 5th, Howard Baker dropped out of the race, not endorsing anyone, leaving the South wide open. Of course, Reagan did quite well in the South in 1976 and was expected to do well again. His only real contender for votes in the South was John Connally. But that would change after the South Carolina primary on March 8th, when Reagan won 54.7% of the vote to Connally's 29.6%. Connally dropped out the next day, indicating that beating Reagan was near impossible. This was perfect timing, as 3 important southern states, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, had their primaries the next week. Reagan swept those states, winning 117 of the 126 delegates available. Not only were the next two primaries important, Illinois and Connecticut, but so was the news around the time of those primaries. First, let's look at the primaries. Illinois was important because it was the home state of Philip Crane and John Anderson, but was also the birthplace of Ronald Reagan. As far as Connecticut, it was the state where Bush grew up and his father, Prescott Bush, served as senator. As far as the news, two big developments happened. First, Reagan, Bush, and Crane started attacking Anderson, who was starting to gain momentum, as not being a true Republican. Crane even said that Anderson was a good candidate, but he was running in the wrong party. When asked by Bush whether Anderson would support the Republican nominee for president, Anderson said that he had intended to be the nominee, but refused to answer if the nominee were someone else. The second bit of news was that Bob Dole dropped out. However, the person that Dole ran under 4 years earlier, former President Gerald Ford, was being mentioned again by those in the media, especially once Reagan started showing momentum. A poll in February after the New Hampshire primary showed Ford beating Reagan 56% to 40% according to Gallup, with Ford beating Bush 51% to 37%. But a month later, Reagan had taken the lead over Ford in the same poll, with Ford announcing on March 15th that he is not running for president and that America needs a new president. The Illinois primary, held on March 18th, dealt a devastating blow to John Anderson and gave the boost that Ronald Reagan needed. Reagan won the primary with 48.4% of the vote, with Anderson a distant second at 36.7%. Bush finished third with 11% of the vote, and Crane received only 2.2% in his home state. He would continue to campaign, but dropped out of the campaign a month later. In Connecticut, Bush won 38.6% of the vote, but Reagan wasn't far behind at 33.9%. The next important state that all three candidates felt that they could compete in was Wisconsin. Anderson, with his congressional district bordering Wisconsin, hoped that he could win. And though he won an impressive 27.4% of the votes, he still finished third behind Ronald Reagan at 40.2% and George Bush at 30.4%. A little over a week later, Anderson met with political consultant David Garth to prepare a report for him regarding an independent run for the presidency. A few days later, those close to Anderson said that it was almost certain that he would run as an independent. The New York Times even conducted a poll which included Anderson. The poll showed that Anderson would win 18% of the votes, with Carter at 35% and Reagan at 34%. And with the Carter versus Reagan poll showing Reagan now up by 1%, which was the first time Reagan had led the poll, it showed that Anderson was taken from both sides equally. On April 24th, Anderson announced that he was an independent candidate for the presidency and no longer contesting the Republican nomination. 2 days before Anderson's announcement, Pennsylvania held its primary, which saw George Bush win 50.5% of the vote. Bush spent over $1 million in Pennsylvania, with Reagan spending only around $200,000. As for the Reagan campaign, they were just trying to secure as many delegates as possible to win the nomination. If anything, Pennsylvania primarily was known for Bush declaring Reagan's economic plan voodoo economics, as well as calling it reckless and simplistic. Bush would go on to win the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Michigan primaries, as well as the Delaware State Convention. Bush was helped in Michigan by winning the support of Michigan Governor William Milliken. When Bush won the primary, he was in Cleveland campaigning for Ohio's June 3rd primary. But in all reality, it was over. Even with Bush's win in Michigan, which won him 53 delegates, Reagan still won 29 delegates in the state. And with strong Reagan states remaining, including Reagan's own delegate-rich home state of California, it was impossible for Bush to win. On May 26, just 5 days after the Michigan primary, Bush dropped out of the presidential race, eventually becoming Reagan's running mate and eventually vice president. Reagan would go on to easily defeat incumbent President Jimmy Carter in the general election. And well, that's it for this video. If you've made it this far, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. You can also support the channel on Patreon. If you would like to learn more about the Democratic Party primary in 1980, you can check that out by clicking the video on the left. If you want to know more about the close 1976 Republican primary between Reagan and Ford, that's in the video on the right. Thank you all very much for joining me today, and bye for now.